The third point of the 7-point system is exposure, is getting your exposure set. Well, there's a couple different things. Let's go ahead and open up an image here. And this little warning, you see that little warning there that shows up? If it shows up there, it just means give it a second. It's not quite done drawing the preview. So you want to make sure you're not making critical adjustments before the full preview is drawn. And it goes away in just a second. Now, first thing is let's go ahead and look at our exposure and decide where we're at. First off is there is an auto button. There's a little auto exposure button here. It used to be really, really, really bad. Like back in CS3, I used to call it the overexposure button or the auto overexposure because you'd click on it and it just overexposed everything. So they changed the algorithm back in CS4. So in CS5, it's pretty much the same. It's hit or miss. It either works pretty well or it doesn't work. So when would I ever hit auto? Well, I'd hit auto if I kind of like, oh, I don't know what to do here. This is just a mess. I hit auto to see what Photoshop thinks. And then it'll kind of, it didn't do really badly here. So, all right. And then to return, you can just go to the defaults, back where you were. All right. Now, so it's worth trying. Sometimes it gives you a good result. And then you can either tweak it from there or you're done. If it doesn't, just click on the default like I just did. Now, let's talk about the problem that this photo has, which is pretty huge. Which is, take a look at the histogram up here in the right corner. And up here in the corner, you'll see there is a little white triangle. I have a name for that. I call that the white triangle of death. The reason being is, if you see that white triangle, see, normally that triangle should be solid black. If it turns white, that means that there is a part of this image that is so bright that it will only become solid white. There will be no pixels there. There will be no detail there. It's just blown out. It's completely blown out. It's called clip. It's clipped. It's clipped off the highlights. And if you want to see what's being lost, if you actually want to see, well, what parts of my photo are actually dying, you can click right on the triangle. And you see how that turned red? All those red areas will be, if you print this image, there will be nothing there. There's no detail. There's no nothing. It's just white. Now, so there's a couple of different things you can do. One of them is to lower the exposure until the white thing goes away. All right, so now it's black and that's what you want. The problem is sometimes you have the exposure right where you want it and they're still clipping. So let's just double click on this so it goes back to where it was, right? That's a little trick to get it back to its default. So I don't really want to lower the exposure. I don't want to underexpose my photo. And this exposure slider controls the main the overall exposure. It's a little bit of a highlight control, if you will, but it's more powerful than the levels one. So let's do this. Instead of changing and lowering the exposure and underexposing our photo, let's go to recovery. Now, you're only going to use the recovery slider in 2 instances. Instance number 1, just what you see here. We've clipped off highlights. That's the warning. The second time you use it is sometimes if you have a bright puffy sky, you drag it all the way over to 100, all the way to the right. It'll help bring back detail in the sky. Those are the only 2 times I use it. But in this case, you want to drag the recovery only as far as you need it and no further. So you start here and you go, oh yeah, I got a problem, but I don't want to lower my exposure. Let's drag the recovery up. And as you drag, watch that triangle and let's see what happens. Okay, boom, we're done. So as soon as it goes away, you stop. Now, what's that done for us? Well, that little bit of adjustment kept our main exposure the same, but it just recovered those very, very bright highlights that we're clipping, just the very, very bright stuff. And if you look at the image and turn on that warning now, there's just a little squidge there. Maybe you could go just a tiny bit further, but it's nothing of important detail. There we go. Now, here's the thing. The key words there were important detail. Just like with white balance, you have to make a reasonable decision. Here you have to make a reasonable decision. Is what was clipping an area of important detail? I don't think so. Let's go back just a hair. Look, it's the highlight on the edge of that little piece of tile. So I don't worry about stuff like that. And there's going to be some times where you're going to have absolute blown out highlights and there's nothing you can do about it and it's okay. For example, take a picture where the sun is clearly visible. The sun will always clip. If the sun is reflecting on a car bumper, there's going to be clipping. So don't just get crazy about, I've got to bring back this clipping. Look at your photo and say, is that an area where there's really important detail that should print or that should be, protected? If it's not, don't sweat it. Sometimes you'll have like shooting some pottery or some cookware or something, and there's a little highlight on some corner that's blown out. Doesn't matter. So make intelligent decisions. If it's important detail, you need to bring it back if you can. If it's not, let it go. All right. So that's how we use it. You start here and then you go there. Again, I just want to say this about recovery. You do not have to use recovery unless you have a problem. So you won't always use recovery. Hopefully, most of the time, you'll be setting it down there at 0 and not have to worry about it. Hopefully, most of the time, your exposure will be right and you won't see a little clipping warning. But if you do see a clipping warning, then it's okay to go to recovery. So now, that's the first part of this, but this whole point, this whole third point of the 7-point system is getting the overall exposure right. So not just this exposure slider in recovery, but kind of this whole section in here that we're working in. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of other things. If you want to see a preview, here, let me just go up here. Oh, by the way, take a look. You see how it turned blue? All right, let's zoom in so you can really see that. See the blue? So it was white, then it turned blue. If it turns blue or red or green, whatever, what that's telling you is we're only clipping in like one channel. It's not clipping all 3 channels, so we're not completely dead. I don't worry nearly as much about clipping an individual channel as I do worry about clipping all 3. So I don't usually worry too much about it unless it's white. When it is one color like that, you're very, very close to bringing it back. Just a little move like that will bring it back just in case you care. All right. That was one part. The second part was we were going to talk about, what was it? We were going to zoom in on something. I showed you that. It was another clipping thing. I can't remember. Oh, here's the other thing. There's another way to look at this. All right, if you hold the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on PC, it gives you a different kind of preview. So if you don't like the red thing, you can Option click on Mac or Alt click on PC, and you see exactly what's clipping. Everything that's in white is fully clipping. The blue is just clipping a little bit, and the green is just, and then here you can do it this way. All right. Now, what's the difference between the two? Personal preference. They both do the exact same thing. By the way, here's the preview. Here's before. Let's turn that off. And after. See, it's a pretty subtle change, but 1, you were losing data. Number 2, you recovered it. You captured it. By the way, you can use the letter P on your keyboard to toggle the preview on and off. So for the rest of this class, if you see me saying, let's take a look at a before and after, chances are that's what I'm doing is just hitting the letter P to give us a before and after. All right, so we've got the kind of exposure thing down. Now, next, let's look at what happens when you have an image that's washed out. All right, so let's go ahead and just throw cancel on here. And then let's open up an image that's washed out. Here's one that's washed out. All right, give it a second to draw its deal. All right, now, so the whole image is kind of washed out. Well, there's a really good thing you could think of the moment you go, it's washed out, I can tell you exactly what to do. If it's washed out, I know to go to the blacks, because chances are if it's washed out, it's lost color saturation and dimension and depth in the shadows. All right, so you'll just go to the black slider and drag it to the right. And look how it brings back that information. All right, really, really quick, really, really easy. So it's just kind of a way to keep that in mind. If my photo's washed out, I know I can fix it by raising the blacks, dragging the blacks slider to the right. Now, how far is of course up to you. Now, there's another control here right below it. Let's back this off a little bit because we're going to use these two in tandem, called brightness. So brightness is your midtones control. You know what I always think about a great way to remember midtones is? If you have a sky that's washed out, grab the brightness slider and drag it to the left. Lower the amount of midtones or brightness. So take a look at the sky here. So if I lower the brightness, watch, there's your sky. Then I'm going to increase the blacks to bring back some of that saturation. Then what I'll do, because the whole thing looks a little dark now, right? But look, I have plenty of space here. This little histogram isn't butting up against that wall, so I can kind of bring up the exposure a bit now. Look how much better everything looks. The sky looks better. The ground looks better. Let's do a preview before and after, right? So look at that. We lowered the brightness to make the sky look better. We brought in the black so it didn't look washed out, but then the whole image looked too dark. And then we just increase the exposure just a little bit like that. And the whole image, let's do a before and after again, looks much, much better all the way around. So that's just a couple of things to keep in mind as far as setting your overall exposure. Now, there is something that we skipped over, fill light, which we're going to cover in just a moment, and we skipped over contrast, which we're going to cover later. But let me just say this at this point. We don't use this slider, contrast. I mean, we might use it here and there, but it's not really what we use to create contrast, so we're going to cover that in a moment. But there is one more thing we need to cover in the next section, and that is fill light, when to use it and why.